Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here so early, much earlier than I would normally be here if I weren't the speaker, but I appreciate your being here. Ever since I published Libertarianism, a primer, and then The Politics of Freedom a couple of years ago, people have been asking me if I have another book. So I'm here to tell you today that I've come up with another book idea, and I think it might actually sell better than my previous books. I got this idea early this year. My new book idea is called Tax Tips for Democrats. And it'll give Democrats ideas that they need to understand about the tax system. And I was really thrilled that when I went around Washington asking prominent Democrats to tell me things they think people should know about the tax system, that I really got a lot of cooperation. I went to the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Charlie Rangel, and I said, what do people need to know about the income tax? And Charlie Rangel said, you know, when you get $1,000 a night in rental income from your villa in the Dominican Republic, you have to pay taxes on that. So that's a good thing to know. And then I went to Tom Daschle, the former Senate Majority Leader, and I said, what do people need to know? And he said, when a business associate gives you $80,000 in consulting fees, it turns out you have to pay taxes on that. And then I went to Tim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, and he said, when your employer gives you extra money to pay your Social Security tax and you sign a form acknowledging that's what the money is for, you actually have to pay the Social Security taxes. Some people say the best thing about electing a Democratic president is all the back taxes we get to collect from their cabinet appointees. Well, as Karl Marx would say, that's the farce. The rest of what's going on in Washington is tragedy. Freedom is under assault in the United States. I'm going to talk about some of the ways. I want to remind you that when I say freedom is under assault, I'm not talking about just the last 4 months. Think about the past 8 years that we went through. We went through, during the Bush administration, the excesses of the Patriot Act, the intrusion of the federal government into local schools, state decisions on marijuana and end-of-life choices, state marriage law, the biggest expansion of entitlements in 40 years, a law to sharply restrict core political speech, the steady accumulation of power in the executive branch and in the person of the president, an unnecessary and still floundering war, the assertion and exercise of the president's power to arrest and incarcerate American citizens on American soil without access to a lawyer or a judge, an increase in federal spending of more than $1 trillion and a near doubling of the national debt, and all of that before the last 100 days of the Bush administration. People talk a lot about the first 100 days of a presidential administration, the first 100 days of FDR, the first 100 days of LBJ. Now they're excited about the first 100 days of Obama. But the last 100 days of the Bush administration were pretty disastrous. It just seemed to me that during the period from September to the end of the Bush administration, it was one assault on freedom and free enterprise after another. And back in September and October especially, I think a lot of us, a lot of free market folks, freedom movement people, were just feeling shell-shocked by one blow to free market capitalism after another. You had the federal takeover of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the bailout of AIG, the all power to Henry Paulson plan, the collapse of Washington Mutual, congressional passage of the power to Henry Paulson plus pork plan, the sharp drops in the Dow Jones average, the Federal Reserve Board's unprecedented decision to lend directly to non-financial companies, the government's partial nationalization of major banks, Paulson's announcement that he would use his bailout money for something other than what he told Congress it would be for, the automobile bailout in direct defiance of a congressional vote, and so on and so on. And one of the problems, especially for a think tank in Washington, was that there was no time to fight any of these measures. Most of them were just announced as done deals every Monday morning. The Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve would hold a press conference to announce what they had nationalized over the weekend. There was no debate. There was no time to argue about it. There was no time to challenge it or analyze it. With the incumbent president in charge, both presidential candidates going along, Most members of Congress afraid to challenge these dire warnings of catastrophe. It was impossible to create any real debate. Defenders of capitalism were reeling. And adding insult to injury, every day I would pick up the Washington Post or the New York Times, and I would read a claim that a problem that had been caused by the Federal Reserve, corporate tax law, and federal housing regulation was in fact somehow to be blamed on the free market and the workings of capitalism. That was really rubbing salt in the wound. There were even a few people, Jacob Weisberg in Newsweek declared that this crisis could be traced to libertarianism, as if there'd been libertarians in the Clinton and Bush administrations making decisions. In fact, everybody in this room knows big government caused this crisis. Big government causes massive problems over and over and then demands more money and more power in a claim that that will fix them. And it does that again and again. And from the government's point of view, if it can cause problems big enough to be called a crisis, so much the better. You get a lot more power if it's a crisis than if it's just a problem. 20 years ago, Robert Higgs wrote a book called Crisis and Leviathan. And what he said in that book was, some people think government in the United States has just grown 1% a year until it got as big as it is. But the fact is, government grows in times of crisis. War, economic depression, maybe natural disaster. That's when the government gets new powers and new money, and then after the crisis, it gives some of the powers or money back, but never all of it. So there's a ratchet effect so that government keeps growing during these crises. More recently, a woman named Naomi Klein wrote a left-wing book called The Shock Doctrine. It was a bestseller. A lot of people thought it was an interesting book. Klein explained that what she was talking about was the shock doctrine is a political strategy that the Republican right has been perfecting over the past 35 years to use for various different kinds of shocks. They could be wars, natural disasters, economic crises, anything that sends a society into a state of shock, to push through what economists call economic shock therapy, policies that they couldn't get through if people weren't in a state of fear and panic. Well, she had a point. Take 9/11. That was a big shock to the system. The bombing, the destruction of American buildings. And what did we get out of 9/11? We got the Patriot Act, the Department of Homeland Security, the federalization of airport screeners. Arguably, we got the war in Iraq. But Naomi Klein would have you believe that after a crisis, you get deregulation and free markets. And obviously, we didn't see any of that coming after 9/11.